Show us what you can do now, Judge! One of the cops jeered, pressing the clippers against her scalp. Laughter roared in the cramped room as dark strands of hair tumbled to the floor. Another officer leaned close, his voice dripping with mockery. You think that robe makes you untouchable? Not here. Not today! The buzzing of the clippers echoed like a chainsaw of humiliation, every stroke meant to strip away her pride, every laugh meant to bury her dignity. The woman they thought was powerless sat silently, her eyes burning with a fire they couldn't yet understand. Before I take you deeper into this shocking story, smash that subscribe button right now and drop a comment with the country you're watching from, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The buzzing clippers sliced through the air like a weapon, their mechanical hum drowning out even the pounding of her heart. Show us what you can do now, Judge! Rick Donnelly barked again, his lips twisted into a sneer as clumps of her hair tumbled onto the cold concrete floor. Brent Carnes chuckled from behind her, his meaty hands gripping her shoulders so tightly it felt like bruises were already forming. You think your robe makes you untouchable? You think you're better than us? Out here, in this room, you're nothing. The laughter stung sharper than the clippers themselves. They weren't just shaving her head, they were shaving away her dignity, piece by piece. And the small crowd of courthouse staff who had been dragged in to watch stood frozen, their phones in hand, some pretending to record while others couldn't even lift their eyes. The humiliation was a theater, and she was the main act. Claudia Hayes, a woman who had stood on the highest podiums of justice, who had silenced rooms with a single ruling, now sat handcuffed in a hard steel chair while two cops treated her like a common criminal. Each strand of hair that hit the floor was a blow to her reputation, each mocking laugh a nail in the coffin of her composure. Yet, her face stayed firm. Not a tear. Not a flinch. Just a steady, searing fire in her eyes that promised this moment would not go unpunished. Smile for the camera, Your Honor, Brent whispered, pulling out his phone. He angled it down toward her jagged scalp as Rick dug the clippers deeper, buzzing carelessly until her head looked raw, uneven, almost butchered. This one's going in my collection. The room roared with amusement, and one of the staffers in the back shifted uneasily, whispering to another. Isn't that Judge Hayes? The whisper was silenced quickly with a sharp glare from Rick. Delete that thought, if you know what's good for you, he growled, snapping his fingers at the staffer. In this room, she's just another mouthy black woman who didn't know her place. Claudia's pulse thundered in her ears, but she refused to look away. Her gaze locked on the cracked light above her, her breathing slow and deliberate. Every humiliation was fuel. Every taunt was fire to the furnace inside her. They thought they were breaking her, but with every buzz of the clippers, they were carving their own downfall. Finally, Rick clicked the clippers off and stepped back, brushing the scattered hair off his uniform with deliberate mockery. Look at her now, he sneered, holding up a small mirror from the counter and shoving it in her face. Does that look like a judge to you? Looks more like a prisoner. Brent laughed, adding, Yeah, a prisoner who doesn't even get commissary privileges. The door creaked open, and Deputy Wallace leaned against the frame, arms crossed, smirking. Well, looks like you boys had fun. He surveyed Claudia with that same venomous satisfaction, like this was a show he'd been waiting years to watch. Careful though, don't leave marks. Can't have evidence. Relax, Rick said, tossing the clippers back in the cabinet. Nobody's going to believe her anyway. Who's going to take her word over 3 decorated officers? Decorated. The word nearly made Claudia laugh. Decorated with what? Complaints, lies, and cover-ups? She knew their type. She'd seen the reports, the lawsuits swept under the rug, the victims who never found justice because men like Donnelly and Carnes had the shield of the badge. And now, she wasn't just seeing it on paper, she was living it. They yanked her to her feet, the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Her balance wavered for a split second, but she steadied herself, spine straightening like steel under fire. They wanted to drag her out broken. Instead, she forced herself to walk with her chin up, her gaze unflinching, as though she were the one in control. Take a good look, people! Brent called out to the clerks and officers lingering outside the security wing. "This is what happens when you lie, cheat, and steal. Even judges ain't safe." His words carried a triumphant cruelty, echoing through the marble hall. The courthouse, usually a temple of justice, now felt like a circus ring, and she was the unwilling spectacle. Phones rose higher. Snickers grew louder. Some whispered doubts, others smirked openly, and still others recorded gleefully, hoping to share the downfall of a woman they once feared. The polished floors reflected Claudia's uneven shadow, her bald head shining under the harsh lights. Every reflection screamed humiliation. But she never broke stride. She never begged. She never let her lips tremble. Because deep inside, she knew a truth none of them yet realized. This was not her downfall, it was theirs. Hours later, when they finally dumped her back onto the main floor with her briefcase tossed at her feet like trash, she picked it up slowly. With deliberate grace, she smoothed her blouse, tucked the badge back into her pocket, and walked away. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to defend herself. She knew the real stage awaited her, the courtroom. And when the courtroom doors opened later that day, when the packed gallery rose to its feet and the clerk's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Claudia Hayes," the world shifted. The very officers who had mocked her, shaved her, humiliated her, sat at the defense table, their faces draining of color as they realized the cruel joke was on them. Claudia walked in with the same steel in her spine, but this time with the black robe flowing over her shoulders, commanding every ounce of respect in the room. Her bald head bore the scars of their cruelty, but under the courtroom lights, it looked like a crown. Her eyes, steady and blazing, locked on Donnelly and Carnes. This was no longer their theater of humiliation. This was her courtroom. And their judgment day had finally arrived. The courtroom was packed wall to wall, the air heavy with anticipation, tension, and whispered curiosity. Reporters filled the benches, their pens scratching furiously against notepads while cameras clicked quietly from the back. Activists in bold shirts sat beside nervous clerks, their eyes fixed on the doors at the rear of the chamber. The defendants at the front table, two officers in their crisp, freshly pressed uniforms, sat with an arrogance that was quickly starting to crack under the weight of silence. They shifted in their seats, fidgeting with their ties, forcing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. For years they had believed themselves untouchable. That day, the illusion was gone. The doors swung open with a loud creak, and a hush fell over the room. Every head turned. Judge Claudia Hayes entered slowly, her stride deliberate, her head bare and marked from the clippers that had torn through her hair hours earlier. The humiliation was etched across her scalp for the world to see, yet she carried herself with a calm dignity that silenced every whisper. Her black robe hung heavy across her shoulders, its folds moving like waves of authority with each step she took toward the bench. The murmurs spread like wildfire, reporters scribbling faster, spectators nudging one another in disbelief. It was her. It had really been her all along. The smirks on the officers' faces drained instantly. Their eyes widened, their bodies stiffened, their arrogance collapsing under the crushing realization that the woman they had mocked, stripped of dignity, and humiliated in a backroom was the very one now presiding over their fate. Rick Donnelly's jaw worked as if to form words, but none came. Brent Carnes gripped the table so tightly his knuckles blanched. Their attorney leaned in, whispering frantically, but they were too frozen in shock to respond. Claudia ascended the steps and seated herself, her eyes sweeping across the room with the weight of justice itself. The clatter of the gavel echoed, sharp and commanding. The silence that followed was suffocating. She looked down at the men before her, not with anger, not with revenge, but with the cold, unshakable authority of law. The balance of power had shifted completely, and they knew it. The prosecutor rose, her voice steady but charged with passion. She laid out the case with precision, her words a dagger cutting through the lies and layers of protection that had shielded Donnelly and Carnes for years. Witnesses were called one by one. Each testimony stacked on top of the last like bricks in a wall closing in on the defendants. Maria Rodriguez, a grandmother with trembling hands, described how her grandson had been beaten during a simple traffic stop. A shop owner recounted the night his surveillance footage was mysteriously erased after capturing evidence of planted drugs. A young man barely 20 spoke with a shaky voice about the night he was choked until he passed out, only to wake up in cuffs with fabricated charges hanging over his head. Every word was a blade cutting deeper into the hollow defense the officers tried to maintain. Their lawyer rose repeatedly, objecting, pushing, scrambling for a foothold, but Claudia's rulings came swift and precise. She struck down weak arguments with measured authority, her voice resonating across the chamber with an edge that made even seasoned attorneys shift uncomfortably. The jury leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting from the witnesses to the defendants. Each story painted the same picture, a pattern of abuse, cruelty, and corruption. Rick's usual bluster vanished, his face pale, sweat gathering at his brow. Brent stared down at the table, his jaw clenched, refusing to meet the gaze of the people he had wronged. The weight of their victims' voices pressed down on them like a mountain. Claudia watched it all with steady control, though the scars of the morning still burned on her skin. Each testimony was a mirror to her own humiliation, each victim's voice a reminder that she was not alone in her suffering. They had tried to strip her of her identity, her dignity, her authority. But here in this courtroom, their cruelty had become their noose. The defense attempted to spin their story, painting themselves as men of honor, officers who had simply done their duty. They tried to twist the narratives of victims, to cast doubt where there was clarity. But with every desperate attempt, the gallery grew restless, shaking heads, whispering in disbelief. Their lies were transparent now. The badges on their chests no longer gleamed with honor, they glared with the weight of guilt. When the prosecutor unveiled the recording, a chilling clip of their voices from the security room mocking Claudia, laughing as they degraded her, the room erupted. Gasps filled the chamber, reporters scribbled furiously, and members of the public cried out in outrage. The defense attorney slammed his fist on the table, objecting, but Claudia's gavel cut through the noise like thunder. Order restored, but the damage was done. There was no defense against their own words. Rick shifted uncomfortably, his once proud shoulders sagging under the weight of exposure. Brent wiped his palms nervously against his pants, the fear in his eyes unmistakable. They were no longer officers. They were predators caught in the light, stripped bare before the very justice they had mocked. Through it all, Claudia remained unshaken, her expression carved from stone. She allowed the process to unfold, never once letting her personal humiliation sway her hand. She didn't need revenge. She had justice, and that was enough. The humiliation they had inflicted was no longer hers to bear. It was theirs. As the session neared its end, the atmosphere was electric, charged with the certainty that a reckoning was near. The jury sat rigid, absorbing every detail. The gallery buzzed with fury and anticipation. The prosecutor closed with words that cut through every doubt: no one is above the law, and no badge can shield cruelty forever. Claudia's gavel came down with finality, echoing like a sentence in itself. Court recessed until morning. The officers were led out in chains, their heads bowed, their arrogance shattered. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, capturing the fallen heroes now unmasked as criminals. The very men who had laughed as they shaved her hair now trembled like children facing punishment. Claudia remained seated, her eyes watching them leave, her body still and unyielding. The humiliation of the morning still lingered, but it no longer felt like defeat. It was a scar, yes, but a scar that told a story of resilience, strength, and ultimate justice. They had tried to break her. Instead, they had built the very stage upon which their downfall now played out. When the room emptied, Claudia finally stood, gathering her robe around her shoulders. The floor was quiet now, but echoes of the clippers, the laughter, and the jeers still lingered in her memory. She touched her scalp lightly, feeling the rough stubble where her hair once flowed. Instead of shame, she felt fire. They had not stripped her. They had sharpened her. Tomorrow, she would walk back into this room, and tomorrow, justice would speak louder than humiliation ever could. The courthouse buzzed with tension the next morning before the trial resumed, the corridors alive with the hum of reporters, activists, and curious onlookers who had heard whispers of what had unfolded the day before. The air carried an electricity that seemed to thrum against the marble walls, as if the entire building itself knew that something historic was about to unfold. The defendants arrived in press uniforms, but the swagger was gone, their steps heavier, their eyes darting nervously at the crowd. The weight of shame clung to them like a second skin. What had once been men who strutted with untouchable arrogance were now shadows of themselves, cornered animals waiting for the inevitable trap to snap shut. When Judge Claudia Hayes entered the courtroom, silence blanketed the space instantly. The sight of her bald, scarred scalp under the harsh light still carried shock, but now it was paired with awe. The audience no longer saw humiliation, they saw resilience carved into flesh, dignity reforged through fire. She moved with precision, her robe trailing behind her like armor, her presence commanding the room with effortless authority. The gavel cracked once, a sharp reminder that this was not theater. This was judgment. The prosecution built its case like a sculptor chiseling stone, every testimony shaping the truth with undeniable clarity. A teenager recounted through tears the night he had been handcuffed and left bleeding on the side of the road after being accused of resisting arrest. A nurse described how medical reports had been falsified to erase evidence of abuse. A former officer, his voice heavy with guilt, admitted that complaints had been buried under layers of bureaucracy, swept aside by the same system now watching itself unravel. Each witness was a hammer strike, breaking away the veneer of respectability the defendants once hid behind. The jury leaned in closer with every story. Faces hardened with disgust. The gallery murmured, restless with anger, fists tightening in solidarity with the victims who had been denied justice for years. Reporters scribbled faster, headlines already forming in their minds. Outside, cameras were rolling, broadcasting each detail to a public hungry for truth. The walls of protection that had shielded Donnelly and Carnes for so long were collapsing before their eyes, piece by fragile piece. The defense scrambled to hold ground, throwing objections like sandbags against a flood. They questioned credibility, painted victims as liars, insisted the officers had only ever acted with honor. But the jury wasn't buying it. Neither was the public. Every objection only underscored their desperation, and every weak excuse was another nail in their coffin. The men who once sneered with unchecked power now squirmed under the gaze of 12 ordinary citizens who saw through them. The climax of the morning came when the prosecutor unveiled grainy security footage from a courthouse camera. Though muffled and distorted, the voices were unmistakable. The mocking tone, the laughter, the sound of clippers buzzing, followed by Rick Donnelly's taunting voice asking if she wanted to beg. The gasp that tore through the courtroom was visceral, a collective reaction that electrified the air. All eyes swung to the defense table, where the officers sat frozen, their faces drained of blood. Even their attorney's hands shook as he fumbled through papers, unable to explain away the undeniable. The gallery erupted in outrage, voices crying for accountability, reporters rushing to capture every reaction. Claudia brought the gavel down, restoring silence with a force that echoed long after the wood struck. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, as she looked down at the men who had tried to strip her of her dignity. They would now be judged not only by her authority, but by the truth they had so carelessly exposed themselves. The room belonged to her, and justice itself seemed to breathe through her presence. As the day wore on, the defendants shrank deeper into their chairs. Rick's bravado had evaporated, his leg bouncing uncontrollably beneath the table. Brent stared blankly at the jury, his jaw so tight it trembled. They whispered to one another desperately, their eyes wild with the realization that the walls were closing in and there was no escape. The arrogance that had fueled them in backrooms and dark alleys was now replaced with the unmistakable scent of fear. During cross-examination, Claudia's control never wavered. Her rulings were sharp, precise, cutting down every attempt by the defense to deflect or distract. She never once acknowledged her own ordeal, never once allowed personal humiliation to cloud her duty. That restraint only magnified the weight of her authority, making her presence even more formidable. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. The very women they had treated as powerless now held their futures in her steady hands. The gallery felt the shift, the slow, steady unraveling of two men who had built their lives on intimidation and deceit. Whispers spread like wildfire. This was bigger than a trial. This was a reckoning for every victim silenced, for every complaint buried, for every injustice stamped with an official seal and swept under the rug. The courthouse, once a stage for their cruelty, was now the arena of their collapse. By the end of the day, the weight of testimony and evidence pressed down like a mountain. The jury's faces were set in stone, their resolve clear. The officer's attorney looked drained, his suit rumpled, his words hollow. Outside, the courthouse steps swelled with protesters, their chants echoing into the chambers, a chorus demanding accountability. The city was watching, and the city would not be denied. Claudia adjourned for the evening, her voice steady, her posture unyielding. She left the bench slowly, her gaze passing once more over the defendants. They couldn't even meet her eyes. Their heads bowed, their bodies slumped, men broken by the very system they had once thought was theirs to control. She walked past them without a flicker of emotion, but inside, her fire burned hotter than ever. Not for revenge, but for justice, for every voice they had silenced. As she stepped into her chambers, the noise of the courtroom still echoed faintly behind her, the cries, the gasps, the chants. She closed the door, the quiet pressing in like a blanket, and allowed herself a single breath. Her reflection in the mirror stared back, her scalp raw, uneven, scarred. But the eyes in the glass burned with an intensity that no clippers, no handcuffs, no humiliation could extinguish. They thought they had broken her. All they had done was prepare her for this moment, sharpened her resolve until it was unbreakable steel. Tomorrow, the verdict would come, and tomorrow, the world would see what true justice looked like. The courthouse was bursting with tension as the final day of the trial dawned, every seat in the gallery filled before the sun had fully risen. Reporters crowded shoulder to shoulder, microphones in hand, their eyes trained on the heavy doors where the judge would soon enter. Protesters outside chanted so loudly that their voices drifted into the marble corridors, a steady drumbeat of outrage and anticipation. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if justice would finally catch the men who had hidden behind their badges for far too long. At the defense table, Rick Donnelly and Brent Carnes looked like ghosts of the arrogant officers who had once strutted through the courthouse. Their uniforms were pressed, their badges polished, but no shine could mask the fear etched into their faces. Rick's jaw twitched uncontrollably, Brent's hands trembled as he shuffled papers he no longer understood. Their lawyer whispered furiously, but they barely heard him. Each tick of the clock was another nail driven into their coffin. The gavel cracked like thunder, and silence blanketed the courtroom as Judge Claudia Hayes entered. Her robe flowed behind her, the weight of authority in every fold. The bald patches on her scalp gleamed under the harsh lights, still a mark of their cruelty, but now transformed into a symbol of resilience. She carried herself like a fortress, unbreakable, unshaken, the embodiment of justice incarnate. The murmurs died instantly. Every eye was fixed on her, and even the defendants lowered their gaze, unable to meet the fire in hers. The prosecutor rose with measured confidence, delivering her closing argument with the precision of a blade. She reminded the jury of every testimony, every victim whose voice had been silenced for years until this moment. She spoke of patterns, of corruption, of unchecked cruelty that had infected not just two officers, but the very system meant to protect. Her words filled the room like a storm, crashing against every wall, leaving no corner untouched. The jury leaned forward, their faces grim, their eyes burning with resolve. The defense tried to counter, their attorney's words shaky, desperate. He painted the officers as men under pressure, misunderstood heroes who had simply made mistakes in the line of duty. His arguments hung in the air like smoke, thin and suffocating, quickly dispersed by the weight of truth. The jury's eyes stayed cold, the gallery's whispers sharp with contempt. No one was buying the performance. The officers looked smaller with every word, shrinking into their seats, consumed by the inevitability of their downfall. When Claudia instructed the jury, her voice carried like iron through the chamber. Her words were steady, commanding, the kind that carved themselves into memory. She reminded them of their duty, to weigh not sympathy, not fear, but evidence. To decide not based on the uniforms worn, but on the actions committed. Her gaze lingered on the defendants as she spoke, not with vengeance, but with the unshakable weight of truth. They shifted uncomfortably under the pressure, sweat glistening at their temples. The jury filed out, the air buzzing with whispers. Hours stretched like eternity as the gallery waited. Protesters outside grew louder, their chants echoing through the walls, fueling the tension until it was almost unbearable. Donnelly sat rigid, staring blankly at the table, his lips moving silently as if praying. Carnes clutched his water glass with shaking hands, unable to drink. Their attorney paced like a man already sensing defeat. Finally, the doors opened. The jury returned, their expressions unreadable, but their determination unmistakable. The foreperson stood, clutching the slip of paper that would decide the fate of men who once thought they were above it all. The gallery leaned forward in unison, breath caught in their throats. The verdict rang out like a bell of justice, guilty on all counts. Civil rights violations, abuse of authority, conspiracy under color of law. Each word fell heavy, final, sealing the fate of men who had laughed as they tore at dignity. The gallery erupted, cheers and cries filling the chamber, reporters rushing to capture the moment. Protesters outside roared even louder, their chants turning into triumphant celebration. The officers sat frozen, the blood draining from their faces. Their attorney slumped back in his chair, defeated. Rick's hands shook uncontrollably. Brent buried his face in his palms. The marshals moved swiftly, securing them in chains, their badges stripped from their chests, their authority reduced to dust. Claudia's gavel struck once, silencing the room. Her voice carried over the noise, steady and unyielding. The verdict was not just justice for the victims. It was a warning to all who thought their power placed them above the law. No badge, no uniform, no shield of authority could protect corruption forever. She stood, her robe cascading around her, her bald scalp gleaming like a crown forged from fire. The humiliation they thought would destroy her had become the very mark of their destruction. But her work was not finished. In her chambers, Deputy Mason was brought before her, the smirk gone from his face. His personnel file lay thick on her desk, years of buried complaints unearthed, patterns of abuse written in ink that could no longer be erased. She read them aloud, her voice steady, each charge a hammer blow. He shifted uncomfortably, sweat pooling at his collar. When she played the recording of his voice ordering the officers to teach her a lesson, the last shred of arrogance fell away. His badge was stripped, his career ended in disgrace, his name forever etched among the guilty. He was led out by marshals, rage and shame twisting his face. Claudia sat alone for a moment after, the courthouse quiet now, the echoes of the trial fading into memory. She touched her scalp lightly, feeling the rough stubble, and closed her eyes. They had tried to humiliate her, to break her, to strip her of the authority she had earned through decades of struggle. Instead, they had forged her into something stronger. Her humiliation had become her weapon, her silence had become her roar, and her scars had become her crown. When she stepped outside into the waiting crowd, the cheers erupted like thunder. Reporters swarmed, activists raised fists, strangers shouted her name with pride. The city that had watched her humiliation now watched her triumph. She raised her hand, not in victory, but in quiet acknowledgement, her face calm, her eyes blazing. She had endured. She had prevailed. And through her, justice had spoken. The officers who once sneered at her dignity now faced decades behind bars. The deputy who once mocked her authority now stood disgraced. And Judge Claudia Hayes walked forward, unbroken, her story a beacon to every victim who had ever been silenced. They had tried to bury her with humiliation. Instead, they had planted the seed of their own downfall. And the world would never forget. And just like that, the officers who once mocked, shaved, and humiliated a woman they thought was powerless were dragged out in chains, stripped of everything they thought could protect them. The deputy who enabled them was exposed, his career shattered. And the judge they tried to break walked out stronger than ever, her scars turned into a crown of fire. But here's the question for you. If you were standing in that courthouse when they dragged her into that back room, would you have stayed silent with the crowd, or would you have spoken up, knowing the risk? Drop your answer in the comments, smash that subscribe button, and tell me where in the world you're watching from, because the next story is even more shocking, and you don't want to miss it.